Welcome to the University of New Hampshire's Latin Grammar Minute. I'm Professor Scott Smith, and this episode is on principal parts of verbs. When you look at your vocabulary list for verbs, you will see that each entry will have four forms. For example, erro, errare, erravi, erratum, which means to wander or to make a mistake. Or video, videre, vidi, visum, which means to see. We call these four forms the principal parts of a Latin verb, because if you know how to use them, you can make every Latin verb form in existence. And you may recall in your English classes having learned the principal parts of English verbs. For example, see, saw, seen, or sing, sang, sung. It's the same principle. You memorize the principal parts and you know how to form all the Latin or English verbs you need. So let's go through these in order. The first form, ero or video, is always going to be what we call the first person singular present active indicative, or more simply, it means I blank in the present tense. So ero means I make a mistake or I wander. Video similarly means I see, or I am seeing. These forms will never be different for any verb. Every verb will mean ix in the first principal part. Let's take a look at a second one. Errare, videre. These two forms are what we call the present active infinitive. You'll probably hear your instructor call it an infinitive. There are more than one infinitive out there, so let's keep in mind that this is a present active infinitive, and it's translated to x. So errare will mean to make a mistake or to wander. The verb videre will mean, therefore, to see. And you may have heard a couple of Latin expressions that have been translated into English. For example, videre est credere, both using the infinitive forms, the ere ending. Videre est credere means to see is to believe, whereas errare est humanum means to err or to make a mistake is human, both using these infinitive forms. And for the first couple of months in Latin, these are the only two forms you'll need to worry about. But you do, when you're learning your vocabulary, have to memorize all four because eventually you'll have to use them, and it's good to get into the habit of memorizing all four principal parts from the very beginning. The third principal part, erravi or vidi, is the first person singular perfect active indicative, which simply means more or less I x'd. So errave means I made a mistake, and vidi means I saw. It's pretty much the past tense of Latin verbs. The fourth principal part is erratum and visum, and it's a form that is variously called either the perfect passive participle or the supine. Whenever you see the it actually is a supine. But in all intents and purposes right now, just learn that form and we'll get back to that down the road. So when you're memorizing, you should chant to yourself, erro, erravi, erravi, erratum, and you will be better for it in the long run. Now, let's take a look at some other things. Each verb is going to be assigned a conjugation, which is just a fancy way of saying a category of verb that acts similarly when you are working with it. And you can tell a verb's conjugation by looking at the present active infinitive, that is the second principal part. First conjugation verbs will have a long A before the re in the infinitive form. For example, errare or laudare, which means to praise. A second conjugation verb will have a long E before the re ending. So in this case, videre, to see, or monere, which means to warn. And it's important to know, and I cannot emphasize this enough, that the second conjugation E is long. Videre, monere, manere. Because, even though you don't know this right now, the third conjugation verb will have a short E and it's pronounced differently, and the accentuation will also be different. But for the time being, just remember a long A means first conjugation, a long E means second conjugation, and you'll be called upon to identify the conjugation of verbs in class. Now, let's take a look at how we find the present stem of a Latin verb, which is going to involve the same principal part, the second principal part. There we are, errare and videre. The two infinitives, and that's where you go to find the present stem. So let's take a look at these individually. What you do to find the present stem is you drop the infinitive ending, which is re, and that gives you the present stem. For example, for errare, it's era. For videre, you'll see vide. And these two are, for all intents and purposes, the present stem. What's really going on, for those of you who want to know the backstory to everything, is that this is the verb stem plus what we call the theme or conjugation vowel, which is the long A. So the actual breakdown is the stem plus the theme vowel a, and that gives you the present stem. But if you just prefer to memorize by dropping the re for the time being, that is going to be fine. The upshot of this is that principal parts are the four forms given to you in the vocabulary entry, and you should remember the phrase principal parts. Second, you should memorize the four principal parts for each verb, even though you're not going to use all four parts right now. And finally, the infinitive form, that is the present active indicative form, the second principal part, will tell you the conjugation of a verb and will also allow you to find the present stem. And that concludes our lesson on the principal parts of Latin verbs.